Brittany stood by the stove, slowly stirring coffee in the Turkish pot. She loved doing this, admiring the morning beauty outside the window regardless of the season. Since she and her husband moved to this spacious country house, she had almost every day start with this ritual. She would sit by the window and sip the divine drink in small sips. Only after that was she ready for a new day, which was always very busy. Brittany was considered one of the well-known notaries in the city, and appointments with her were booked weeks in advance. Her goal to become successful and wealthy had been with her since childhood. After losing her parents in a car accident, she was raised by her grandmother. What could an elderly person, who had lived all their life in the village on a survivor's pension and her grandmother's modest income, provide? They barely made ends meet, and so Brittany set out to study hard and move to the city. She entered law school and successfully completed all the years there. The best graduate of her class was immediately hired by one of the largest notarial firms, where she met Eric. That same year, which wasn't very fortunate for her, a month after graduating, her grandmother passed away, which was a significant blow. But life continued to go on. A few months later, a young entrepreneur came to their firm to arrange a power of attorney and fell in love with her at first sight. Every evening he met her after work, always with a bouquet, and behaved very gallantly. Brittany enjoyed spending time with him, but at that moment she was completely immersed in work. Eric would schedule dates, invite her to dinner or to the movies, but Brittany had no time for that. She felt that she could achieve a lot and threw herself into her work. For the first year or two, she practically lived in the office, and it paid off. Clients recognized her and started recommending her to others as a responsible and competent notary. Very quickly, she was able to move from a rented apartment to her own spacious one, which she bought with her hard-earned money. Brittany was ready to give up on her personal life and fully dedicate herself to her career, but life had other plans. One spring day, Eric appeared at the firm again. After completing the necessary paperwork, he smiled and suggested, "Brittany, I'm very glad to see you again. Have you eaten today? I invite you to lunch at a very cozy cafe where we can sit and chat." She was in a good mood, and it was indeed time for a snack, so Brittany agreed. They spent an entire hour in an amazingly quiet and cozy place, and they couldn't stop talking. This time, for some reason, she didn't want to part with Eric at all. That same evening, Eric was already standing in front of the notarial firm with a huge bouquet of flowers. They started dating, and within a couple of weeks, he proposed to her. There was no loud wedding. They simply ordered dinner at a restaurant and started living together. For a while, they frequently went to the theater, the movies, and even went to the seaside for vacations a few times. Eric already had a small business in furniture manufacturing and sales. It didn't bring in big money, but there was always a steady income. Brittany, on the other hand, often earned more from her work than her husband, but she also had to give her all. She could leave before dawn and return after dark. Sometimes she even had to take work home if someone urgently needed her services. Eric was unhappy about this and often asked, "When will people have weekends and vacations? You can't earn all the money in the world, and we have everything we need, a house, 2 cars. What more do we need at such times?" Brittany would always try to explain to her husband that people came to her of their own accord, and she couldn't and didn't want to turn them away. Her thoughts were interrupted by her husband's groggy voice. "Good morning. Off to work again? It's Saturday. Don't you have weekends or holidays?" Without waiting for a reply, he went into another room. At that moment, Brittany thought about how her husband had changed recently. He often seemed to be in a depressed mood, as if plagued by gloomy thoughts. Brittany tried to talk to her husband and find out if there were any problems with his business, but he would only answer thoughtfully, "Everything's fine." For the past couple of weeks, Eric seemed to be avoiding communication with her and responded briefly to any questions, making it clear that he wasn't in the mood for conversations. After finishing her coffee, Brittany got ready for work. From the room, she heard Eric, having skipped breakfast, hurrying somewhere and slamming the front door. She decided not to think much of it. He sometimes went to the gym on weekends, so she took it in stride, remembering that she wanted to take a very old but necessary reference book to work. Brittany went into the home office. She had to work from home a lot, and she couldn't imagine a better place. There was nothing superfluous: a work chair with a laptop, a comfortable armchair, and bookshelves running along the entire wall. That was everything she had filled the room with over time. Despite the large amount of literature, Brittany knew exactly where everything was. She glanced at the top shelf with dismay, recalling that a stepladder was set up on the side of the bookshelf specifically for such purposes. She unfolded it and climbed up. To her surprise, on the shelf below, she noticed a small device resembling a camera pointed directly at her. Brittany froze, deciding what to do next, but after some thought, left the discovery in place. She wanted to first figure out how and why the camera ended up in her office. The entire drive to work, she thought about what had happened, and as she was approaching the office, was certain that her husband was behind it. No one else could have entered her office, and even if someone had, only he would know that she had removed unnecessary literature from the top shelf. Eric must have been sure that since Brittany hadn't climbed up there in so long, she wouldn't notice the camera. Sitting in the car in front of the office, she suddenly thought with horror that she often took wills, contracts, and other confidential information home. The mere thought that someone could have accessed this information to blackmail her clients made her break into a sweat. "That bastard! That scoundrel!" Brittany exclaimed, hitting the steering wheel with her hand. She started the car again and, turning around, rushed home. Analyzing what had happened, she began to understand with growing horror that her husband could easily sell the information from the wills to interested relatives and the data from contracts and agreements to competitors. For her as a notary, this would mean the collapse of her entire career. Deciding to return to the house without her husband hearing, Brittany left her car behind the gate. Quietly opening the front door, she paused for a moment on the threshold, trying to determine where her husband was. Hearing his voice from the office, she approached and abruptly opened the door. What she saw utterly devastated her. Eric was sitting in the chair at the open laptop with a young woman on his lap, holding her around the waist. They were intently watching the screen and were completely unprepared for her arrival. Brittany silently approached the desk and noticed that the laptop was recording from the very camera she had discovered. The young woman jumped up as if scalded and instantly disappeared through the door. Eric, with a trembling voice, began to speak. "Brittany, I'll explain everything. You see, I didn't tell you, but my business is almost bankrupt. The competitors have crushed me, the bastards. I needed money, so I decided to sell the information. And, it turns out there are many people interested in it." Brittany slapped him with all her might, then screamed, "How could you? Did you even think about me for a second? I've worked so hard to achieve what I have, and you were ready to destroy everything for money. If anyone finds out what you've done, I might as well give up my career." Holding back tears, she looked at her husband and added, "You've betrayed me twice. First when you set up that camera, and second when you brought that girl into our home. I hope you understand that I'm not going to pretend nothing happened. I'm filing for divorce tomorrow, and you'd better accept it." Swallowing the lump in her throat, Brittany gathered her courage and said, "And now get out of my office." Eric tried to say something in his defense, but she interrupted him. "Out. Get out of here." Understanding that his wife would not change her mind, Eric left the house, slamming the door behind him. Brittany sat down on a chair and cradled her head in her hands. At that moment, she wanted to howl with pain and betrayal. The person she had lived with all this time, and who had proclaimed his love for her, turned out to be a real scoundrel. She knew that her life wouldn't end here and that she wouldn't die without him. But her heart felt painfully filthy and despicable. She called her boss and requested a day off. In her state, she couldn't possibly think about work. Trying to calm herself, Brittany contemplated her next steps. In a fit of rage, Brittany stripped the bed linens from the bed she had shared with her husband, imagining how he was now indulging in passion with his mistress. Then, taking the largest suitcase, she began tearing his clothes from the hangers and stuffing them into it. When she had packed everything that seemed to be related to Eric, it felt like she was erasing him from her life once and for all. By evening, she had calmed down somewhat, and after taking a shower, she fell asleep almost immediately. The next day, as promised, Brittany filed for divorce and hoped it would be a quiet and painless process. But things didn't go as planned. It turned out that the mistress had a real estate agent acquaintance who quickly managed to prove that all the property acquired during the marriage belonged to Eric. This was a real shock for Brittany, but her desire to erase her ex from her life was so strong that she was ready to do anything. The house was quickly sold for much less than its market value due to the urgency. The money was divided, and Eric left the city with his mistress. Brittany rented an apartment near her work. She was ready to start her life from scratch and planned to eventually buy something in the countryside again. A few days after the divorce, her boss called her in. From the moment she stepped in, she could tell that her boss was in a bad mood. Pointing to the chair across from him, Ethan began to speak, as if choosing his words carefully. "Here's the situation. I've received information that some materials you worked with have been leaked. I hope you understand that this is not the best advertisement for us. A notary is like a doctor. They know everything but are not allowed to disclose it." And now this Ethan looked intently at Brittany, and after a brief pause, added, "Of course I'm not firing you right now. As they say, you're not caught, you're not a thief. But keep in mind, if anything like this reaches me again, we'll have to part ways soon." Some clients began refusing to work with her. This was understandable. No one wanted their personal information to fall into the wrong hands. But there were a few loyal, devoted clients who had been coming to her for years. Among them was Gregory, a successful businessman known throughout the city. Brittany had communicated with him purely on business terms while she was married, but one day, having learned of her divorce by chance, Gregory invited her to dinner. "You are a very beautiful and intelligent woman. Don't be upset, it just means he wasn't your prince," he said with a smile, seeing how hard she was taking the situation. They had a wonderful evening at a small restaurant. Gregory turned out to be an ideal conversationalist with a very subtle sense of humor. Brittany came back feeling like a different person, as if she had begun to believe that happiness was still possible for her. After that evening, they met a few more times, and each time Brittany found herself thinking about how well she got along with him. It was as if he could sense her soul and was always ready to adjust to her mood. She picked up his business card several times and considered calling him, but immediately stopped herself. She didn't want to be pushy. Gregory had made no promises and was entitled to his personal life. Brittany understood this perfectly in her mind, but her heart didn't obey. She was in love and thought about him every day. He was the person she wanted to be with. Gregory valued and loved everything that she valued and loved. His disappearance greatly upset her. Just when Brittany had almost come to terms with the end of their relationship, Gregory reappeared. He called Anne, saying that he was in the hospital, asked her to come to draft some documents. She dropped everything and rushed to him. When Brittany entered the hospital room, her heart seemed to break. Gregory was lying there, significantly thinner, with dark circles under his eyes, but it was clear that he was very happy to see her. "Brittany, I'm so glad to see you," he began in a weak voice. Taking a deep breath, he continued, "You see, not everything in this life can be bought." He coughed heavily, took a few sips from the glass on the bedside table. She sat down next to the bed and asked fearfully, "What happened? Why are you here? How can I help?" "It turned out like this," Gregory said with a sad smile, and continued, "The doctor said I don't have much time left, but we still need to finish a few things. I need to sign some contracts, and I really need your help with that." Brittany filled out all the necessary paperwork for Gregory, then spent a long time sitting in the room, trying to reassure either herself or him that things could still be okay. She desperately wanted to believe it and tried to convince Gregory that he would definitely recover, but he just looked at her with love and held her hand tightly. From the day Brittany first visited the hospital, her entire life became devoted to her beloved. Every free moment she rushed to him, ready to care for him day and night, praying for his recovery. It seemed that the formerly work-obsessed Brittany was now willing to give up all her clients just to be with her loved one every second. But unfortunately, this could no longer help Gregory. Each day he grew worse and worse, literally fading before her eyes. Every time Brittany entered the room, Gregory gathered his strength, trying to smile. One day, suddenly, he said, "Brittany, you're an amazing woman. I love you so much and regret that I couldn't make you happy." It was clear that it was very hard for him to speak, but after taking a deep breath, he continued, "I want everything I have to go to you. Just promise me that if I do die, which is likely to happen soon, you'll start a new life, not looking back or dwelling on the past." She didn't want to hear this at all and abruptly cut him off. "I want everything I have to belong to you. You deserve it. Knowing my relatives, I must protect you from unnecessary disputes and division of property." During their time together, Brittany learned that Gregory had been divorced for over 10 years. He had no children from the marriage, but sometimes he talked about his brother, who frequently extorted money from him and didn't appreciate his hard work. "I know my relatives well, just like my brother. They'll squander everything I've worked for in a matter of days, and you'll need it," Gregory said. Understanding that convincing him otherwise would be difficult, she agreed but realized she couldn't handle the situation alone. She invited a colleague to assist with drafting the will. To her surprise, the next day, her boss called her in and, from the moment she stepped through the door, started yelling, "This is going beyond reason. I turned a blind eye to the fact that you managed to let confidential client information leak. I felt sorry for you, gave you a chance, thought the gossip would die down, and that you'd still be the best notary in town. But alas, no. Most of the clients left on their own, and you refused the rest. Your contribution to our business in the past couple of months has been nearly zero." It was evident that he was literally boiling with indignation. Pulling a handkerchief from his jacket pocket, he wiped the sweat that appeared on his forehead and continued in the same outraged tone. "I still can't understand what could have influenced someone as career-driven as you. You were willing to sacrifice everything for your work. Now I understand perfectly you found yourself a wealthy man and led him to make a will. Do you realize how despicable that is? It tarnishes our name." Brittany, who had been standing there like a statue, suddenly understood. She had heard that someone in their notary office was reporting everything to the boss, but she didn't realize that it was Jill, who had specifically asked her to come to the hospital and draft the will at Gregory's request. She abruptly left the office, leaving the stunned boss in shock, and within a few minutes returned with her resignation letter. "Here, I'm leaving." She threw the paper on the desk and headed for the door, turning back to add, "By the way, what's the name of that colleague's action that led you to discover the will?" Smirking, she slammed the door with all her might and, gathering her things, left immediately. The most surprising thing was that she felt not an ounce of regret. On the contrary, she felt relief because now she could dedicate all her time to Gregory. Brittany's heart was breaking as she looked at her beloved. He was becoming less and less conscious. It was hard to recognize the once handsome man now reduced to a lifeless skeleton covered in bluish skin. Brittany was holding on by a thread, wanting to howl and roll on the floor in despair. Before her eyes, her beloved, with whom she had dreamed of living happily ever after, was dying. But she tried to stay strong. Every day from the moment the hospital opened, she took care of him, talked to him, and believed that everything would be all right. But the miracle didn't happen. One morning she found the room empty and understood everything. The world seemed to collapse. Brittany didn't remember how she ended up on the waterfront, and sitting on a bench, she broke down in tears. Just recently the successful notary, she now found herself an unemployed, lonely woman living in a rented apartment. The whole day she sat on the waterfront like a zombie, not believing that Gregory was gone. She missed him, his smile, his eyes, his tender hands. She didn't know what to do next or how to live. Somehow, eventually making it home, she felt empty and lost. Brittany took a sedative and fell asleep immediately. She was awoken by a phone call. An unknown male voice said ominously, "You got what you wanted, Charm, the brother. I won't let this go easily. I'm sure it was you who forged the will. I'll make sure everyone knows about you." Brittany didn't listen further, and throwing down the receiver, buried her face in a pillow. She immediately guessed that it was Gregory's brother calling. He didn't care about anything except the money. Brittany, however, couldn't accept that her beloved was gone. After Gregory's funeral, where all the relatives looked at her as if she were an enemy, she didn't leave the house for several days. She had no desire to eat, drink, or even live. How could she explain to anyone that Gregory had made arrangements for his estate himself and she had nothing to do with it? It is unknown how long Brittany would have remained in this semi-conscious state if it hadn't been for a dream. A few days after the funeral, Gregory appeared to her, cheerful and as always smiling. He said, "Well, my dear, aren't you keeping your promise? This won't do. You swore that if I were no longer here you would move on and not dwell on the past. I want to see you happy. I always wanted that. Live, rejoice, and don't pay attention to anyone." That morning she woke up a completely different person. It was as if Gregory had breathed life into her. Brittany decided to start over and immediately set out to look for a job. She spent a whole day visiting offices and notary firms, but everywhere she was met with rejection. They didn't even try to explain the reason, they simply said no, and that was it. Brittany understood that bad rumors spread much faster than good ones, and it would surely be difficult to find something in her main field. Also, paying for rent would soon become a challenge. At that moment, she didn't want to think about money. The inheritance she received wouldn't cover all her expenses. All she had to rely on was some savings left from her divorce and the sale of her house. Trying to stay positive, Brittany wandered the city day after day, searching for work. She wanted to believe that she would definitely find something. One day, while walking through a park near her home, she saw a man sitting on a bench whose face seemed vaguely familiar. With his eyes closed, he was dozing in the sunlight, happily smiling at something. The jacket the stranger was wearing was all patched up, and his pants, clearly too short, revealed his thin ankles. His appearance evoked nothing but pity. Brittany suddenly remembered where she had seen this person before. He had once come to the notary office where she worked, and sitting by the entrance in the mornings, had asked for help. She had even given him some money a few times. Now, for some reason, she felt the urge to help the poor man again. Taking out her wallet and sadly counting the money, she pulled out a few 10-ruble bills. She wanted to gently place the money in his hand, but the man opened his eyes at that moment. Seeing the money she was offering, he said somewhat bewildered, "Thank you very much, but this is too much." But Brittany was already walking further down the path, sorting through the bills. Suddenly, she saw a piece of paper that had fallen out and gotten stuck between them. Picking it up, she glanced over it quickly and looked at the note. Puzzled, there were only a few words, but they were clearly written with feeling. "My dear, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer here. Take care of yourself and live every day, forgetting the past. I love you." The vagabond picked up the bag that was standing nearby, and as quickly as he could, followed Brittany, catching up with her just before she was about to leave the park. He touched her on the shoulder and said, "Excuse me, you dropped this. Actually, the note was among the money you gave me. Here, take it." He handed her the note, and Brittany remembered how she had found it in the room after Gregory's death. She had kept it in her wallet and, not noticing, had given it along with the money to the stranger. Taking the note in her hands, she barely managed to hold back her tears. Noticing the change in her mood, the vagabond asked, "Is something wrong? Let's sit down. It might help to talk." Surprising herself, Brittany suddenly agreed. They headed to the nearest bench, where she told Jesse that was the man's name everything. She began with her husband's betrayal, then talked about the shattered dream of being a successful notary and the loss of her job. In telling her story, she felt as if she was talking to the only person with whom she could be happy. Listening to her in silence, Jesse said with concern, "I'd really like to help you. Just tell me how and I'll do it. But please don't cry." Brittany took a handkerchief from her purse and wiped her tears, answering sadly, "How can you help me? I'm in a dire situation myself, no home, no job. Remember I said something joyful? Well, that was probably a mistake. There might be a problem with the house, But about the job, I have an idea. I don't always beg for alms, I substitute a couple of times a week." His eyes sparkled with joy, and smiling mysteriously, Jesse continued, "And it seems I know where you can find a job. Yesterday, at a station not far from the city, I saw an ad. A store is looking for a consultant. It's not an ideal salary, but it's something. I can even go with you to support you." After thinking it over, Brittany agreed, and the next morning Jesse was already waiting for her at the entrance. This time he was wearing a faded sweater, but it had no holes or patches. His pants, surprisingly, were of the right length. At their first meeting, he seemed almost like a father figure to her. When she mentioned this to Jesse, he cheerfully exclaimed, "Great, wonderful. See, my help was useful. I suggest we celebrate with ice cream. I made a decent amount yesterday, so it's on me." There was still half an hour before the train arrived. Brittany agreed. They sat on the platform, chatting about trivial things and eating ice cream bars. For the first time in a long while, she felt somewhat at ease, as if her past troubles and problems had vanished. Jesse turned out to be an amazing person. He was knowledgeable and a great conversationalist. Brittany was inwardly surprised at how someone like Jesse could end up on the streets. On the way back, she asked him about it. With some reluctance, Jesse shared a bit about his past. Once, like Brittany, he had everything: a home, a wife, a job. But everything collapsed more than 6 years ago. His wife, who turned out to be his mistress, was in an accident and, never regaining consciousness, died. Brittany could see that the memories were painful for him, but Jesse continued. "Back then I didn't know what hurt more, her betrayal or her death, but I found only one way out. I started drinking, as they say, never sober. Losing my job, I began to sell and drink everything from home, and then, thanks to some scammers, I just ended up on the streets. I don't know what happened." Looking out the train window at the passing houses, he spoke softly. "Only after losing everything did I seem to wake up, but it was too late." Looking at Brittany with a hint of fear, he added, "Don't think badly of me. I've been sober for over 4 years now. I don't drink anything except water." Brittany looked at him, her heart filled with pity and compassion for this man. She wanted to hug him and never let go. Almost frightened by her own feelings, she turned her gaze away. "It seems our meeting was not in vain. Our lives are somewhat similar. We had everything, and it all disappeared. Now we're starting over." Realizing that she had spoken in rhyme, she laughed. Jesse, seeing her smile, also grinned. Returning to the city, he walked Brittany to her building, discussing the day. Neither of them wanted to part, but Brittany sadly said, "I have to go. I have work early tomorrow." "Thank you, Jesse. You're a very good person." Saying this, she left and spent the entire night thinking about him. She still couldn't understand what was happening in her heart, but in the morning, seeing Jesse at the entrance, she was overjoyed. With a friendly smile, he said, "Hi, I thought I'd walk you to the train. If you don't mind." In the evening, he was again waiting for her at the platform. From that day on, without asking for permission, he met and saw her off every day. Brittany began to notice that she was getting used to this person. Being near him felt easy and calm. The week flew by unnoticed. The job wasn't difficult, but it didn't pay very much either. She was slowly getting used to it, and just when it seemed that life was starting to improve, something happened that threw her off course. That day, Jesse, as always, met her at the station, and when they were approaching her building, Brittany felt everything around her start to fade as if into a fog, and she remembered nothing more. The first thing she saw when she regained consciousness was white walls around her. Looking around, she realized she was in a hospital. That same day, after all necessary examinations, a doctor entered the room and said, "Well, my dear, do you feel that you're pregnant? The baby has been in your womb for more than 3 months now." "But I didn't," Brittany asked faintly, thinking it might just be a hormonal imbalance due to stress. She couldn't believe what was happening. After all, she had only been intimate with Gregory once, just a few days before he learned about his illness. It turned out that all this time she had been living without even realizing the gift her beloved had left her as a farewell. If Gregory were alive, she would have been on cloud 9, but not now. Brittany didn't know what to do. On one hand, she very much wanted to have the baby, as it was from her beloved. On the other hand, she realized she wouldn't be able to manage alone. At that moment, Brittany suddenly remembered that Kyle, the gentleman she had spoken to, said, "Brittany, this gentleman Kyle will help you with everything. He knows what I had and how much, and he will do everything needed to help you manage things." Returning home, Brittany found his phone number and immediately called, saying she wanted to get the money for the items given to her. Moreover, she heard in response that Gregory's relatives had decided to contest the will and were already preparing documents for court. This meant that she would have to deal with her problems on her own again. While her pregnancy was still not visible, Brittany could still go to work, but she understood that soon her secret would become obvious. This meant that at any moment she could be left without a means of support. The doctors also said that with her indicators, the pregnancy might end in a miscarriage. She decided not to tell anyone. On the first day after her hospital stay, Jesse anxiously said, when he saw her, "You scared me so much. You stood there, and suddenly you turned pale. I barely managed to catch you. What did the doctor say? Nothing serious, Brittany replied. No, I tried to find out everything from them myself, but they said they only share such information with relatives. Jesse noted he continued to see her off and meet her, but he was even warmer and more caring than before. Brittany couldn't imagine how she would manage without him. Secretly from Jesse, feeling unwell a few times, she went to the doctor, and each time the doctor said the same thing: she needed rest, no exertion, and plenty of vitamins. Otherwise, there was a risk of miscarriage. Brittany understood this, but she couldn't do anything. She simply couldn't survive without a job, and her salary barely covered rent and modest food, let alone vitamins. Moreover, she was troubled by how to tell Jesse about the pregnancy. After all, soon it would become noticeable, but she couldn't bring herself to have this conversation. She was scared that upon learning of it, he would disappear, so she continued to remain silent. Not only was Brittany already overwhelmed with problems, but her ex-husband also reappeared. Having somehow found the address of her rented apartment, he showed up one evening. Eric was crying, kneeling, and begging for forgiveness. "I can't go on like this anymore," said the unfaithful husband with a trembling voice. "I realize that I love only you. I can't live with her. I understand now what a foolish thing I did." Grabbing Brittany's hands, he started kissing them and then, raising his eyes in plea, asked, "Can you forgive me? Let's try to start over." Brittany jerked her hands away and said angrily, "Never. Enough with the theatrics. I'm in love with someone else, and I'm not going to change anything. Leave now, or I'll call the police." At that moment, she was seething with anger. After everything he had done, this scoundrel had the audacity to come with such a proposal. Eric tried to say something else, but as soon as Brittany reached for the phone, he silently turned and left. It seemed like only half an hour had passed, but the resentment lingered for the entire evening. It was then she realized how easily love can turn into hatred. The next day, when Jesse was waiting for her at the entrance, he smiled and said, "Good morning, my queen. What can I do to make you happy today?" In the evening, after her discharge from the hospital, he indeed started meeting her with something delicious. The gifts were modest: a chocolate bar, ice cream, or some fruit, but Brittany appreciated them greatly. She had noticed that since they met, Jesse had changed significantly. She knew he had gotten a job as a janitor, received a service room, and was no longer like the vagrant in the park or the one sitting by their office. To please her, he was now always shaved, dressed modestly but neatly and cleanly. With each passing day, Brittany discovered new positive traits in him, and each time she felt ashamed that she still hadn't managed to muster the courage to tell him about the pregnancy. One day she had finally gathered her courage, but life once again surprised her, and this time it was a good surprise. Returning from work one day, she found a hefty envelope in the mailbox. The address and the name of the sender were unknown to her, but her name was on the recipient line. At home, she opened the envelope to find a small letter and a tiny flash drive. The unknown sender had anticipated problems with the will and had asked his lawyer to protect Brittany if necessary. Additionally, he had recorded a video stating that he had decided to leave everything to her while he was of sound mind and body. Finally, the lawyer wrote that they had won the court case and she could legally manage all that had been left to her. Brittany grabbed the flash drive and hurried to her room. At that moment, she was grateful that she had taken her laptop during the divorce. She spent the entire evening watching the short 5-minute video and listening to Gregory's familiar voice. Gregory, already weak, talked about how he had consciously decided to leave everything to her, as she was the closest and dearest person to him. He regretted that he never had the chance to experience family life, but he wanted her to have what he could give her. "If only you were alive," Brittany cried quietly, and watched the video over and over again. She felt as though Gregory was not dead and would soon call her visit, but then she would realize that it would never happen. When Jesse came to see her off to work, she told him about what had happened, and after a pause, suddenly said, "And there was something else I wanted to tell you. Remember when I got sick in the hospital? The doctor said I was pregnant. I thought about it for a long time and decided to keep the baby since it's Gregory's child." She looked at Jesse with tear-filled eyes and quietly added, "I was hesitating to tell you. I'm afraid you'll leave me." He stopped, lifted her face by the chin, looked into her eyes, and then gently said, "Silly, I love you. Haven't you figured that out yet? And if you don't mind, I'd like to become a father." Without waiting for Brittany's response, he suddenly seemed embarrassed and said, "I also wanted to tell you that I can't live without you, and I suggest we move in together." Brittany hugged him, pressed against his chest, and quietly said, "Okay." That evening, Jesse moved into Brittany's rented apartment, and her days began to be filled with care and love. It turned out that, in addition to all his virtues, Jesse was a great cook and made an effort every day to treat Brittany to something delicious, always saying, "You need a full and varied diet." Brittany just laughed in response and kissed her beloved with gratitude. She saw that he was really making an effort to make her feel happy and protected. Jesse somehow managed to get a job as a mover at a nearby supermarket. He started earning better, and to balance work with the necessary free time, Brittany decided, after consulting with Jesse, to open her own business. With the inheritance money she received, she couldn't just give up her dream. And after taking care of all the formalities, she opened a notary office. The most interesting part was that Jesse was very helpful in this. It turned out that he had once had a small company, which was another revelation and a true gift of fate. There was not much time left before the birth, and they needed to get a lot done. Together with Jesse, they settled all the formalities and the baby, as if sensing this, was born right after they opened their office. Brittany gave birth to a boy, and from the very first moment, Jesse was ready to dote on him. She decided to name the baby Gregory, and Jesse was completely fine with it. He was ready to hold the baby all the time and considered him his son. There was just one problem. Gregory was born weak and often fell ill. Apparently, the troubled pregnancy took its toll. When he turned 6 months old, they ended up in the hospital. After a long examination, the doctor said that the baby might need surgery, but it wasn't yet clear what type. Brittany and Jesse didn't understand why this was necessary, but they still completed all the required tests, as it was important for their son. Brittany explained to the doctor that the boy's biological father had passed away and Jesse was only planning to adopt Gregory. However, the doctor insisted, "I still recommend having tests done for both of you. You never know. It's important to check if everything is all right with your health. As you understand, the boy's condition is weak, and an infection could seriously harm him." Jesse and Brittany did not argue and returned the next day for the results. Their surprise was great when the doctor mysteriously said, "You say this is a stranger to the boy? Well, the tests show that the baby and Jesse are as close as possible relatives." Brittany and Jesse looked at each other, not understanding what was happening. "This can't be," Brittany said, her voice barely audible and her face pale. "There must be a mistake." Jesse asked immediately, supporting her by the arm. Staggering, Brittany sat down in tears. He began to say, "This can't be. I thought he was dead. I lived my whole life thinking my brother was gone. He's alive." Brittany sobbed in response, "Your brother for sure." Jesse added, "Do you understand?" Brittany stared at him unblinking, as if trying to grasp what he was talking about. Jesse covered his face with his hands and, trembling, continued to cry. She realized he was crying. Always calm and composed, he now looked like a frightened boy. The doctor, not understanding what was happening, decided to give him a sedative. After a few minutes, Jesse explained, "I was about 6 years old then. I vaguely remember having parents and a little older brother, but I got sick and stayed home while the family went somewhere for business, taking a trembling hand." He took a few sips of water. "And that was the last time I saw them alive. I only remember some people in uniforms, a crying neighbor, and then the orphanage." Looking at Brittany, he seemed to expect a response and asked, "So does this mean only the parents died and the brother survived?" Turning to the doctor, he asked, "Could it be that Gregory is my brother's son?" The doctor nodded and confidently said, "I can say with 90% certainty, though I never claim 100%, that the degree of relation is very close. Therefore, without a doubt, this baby is your nephew." Jesse threw himself at Brittany and, crying, said, "You're my family now. I'm definitely not letting you go anywhere." "Well, thank you," said the doctor, jokingly warning them. "All right, enough with the tears. You still have a son to raise and you're both on the verge of a nervous breakdown. I'll prescribe you a mild sedative. After everything that's happened, you'll need to take something like this for a couple of days, or I won't let you near the child." That evening, Jesse and Brittany talked long into the night about what had happened. Then he hugged her and hesitantly asked, "Will you marry me? I know that for a wealthy bride like you, there might be better options, but no one, believe me, no one will love you and your son like I do." Fearing she might refuse, he quickly added, "I don't need anything else, just that you be with me. Believe me, now I have someone to live for, and I will do everything to become as successful as my brother. I know I'm not 20 anymore, but that's for the better. I'll make the most of it." He was afraid to look at Brittany, but she stepped closer, wrapped her arms around his neck, and whispered, "Of course I agree, and I don't meet anyone else but you and our son. You are my happiness." Gregory had the surgery and recovered quite quickly. The doctors began talking about his discharge. Jesse came home with a huge bouquet and, handing her a small box with a modest but beautiful ring, said, "I want to do everything properly, and since we don't have any family, I'll handle the proposal myself. I officially ask you to be my wife, and I'm warning you right now, I will make sure that Gregory becomes my son." Right there, Brittany looked at him with happy eyes, unable to believe that happiness had finally found her. Though she didn't want to jinx it, there was some lingering fear. As if sensing this, Jesse hugged her and firmly said, "Everything will be all right. I'm sure of it." Jesse surprised his beloved on their wedding day. He had reserved a table at a small, cozy cafe. They went to the registry office together. Jesse had indeed arranged everything, and in one day he became both a husband and, immediately, Gregory's father. Brittany was glowing with happiness. Now she understood why she had approached the homeless man in the park back then, as he bore some resemblance to her Gregory. After their son started recovering, Brittany threw herself into work. To her surprise, many clients gradually returned to her, and she valued their trust greatly. The notary office quickly gained a new, excellent reputation, and clients had no hesitation in passing her contact information along. Jesse, on the other hand, was preoccupied with something and would smile and say to any questions from his wife, "Don't worry, I'm not planning to live off my brother's money, and I won't be a burden on you either." As soon as their son grew a bit, he was enrolled in a very good private kindergarten, and Jesse started his own business, which Brittany had no idea about. It turned out that all this time he had been reconnecting with his old partners and friends, and they quickly resumed custom home construction. It turned out that this was what he had been doing before. One day when he came home, he said mysteriously, "All right, my dear ones, I'm inviting you on a little trip. Gregory, quickly put on your shoes and follow me. Mom will get ready while we wait." Brittany tried to resist, jokingly saying, "Oh, didn't our dad forget that Gregory needs to go to bed in an hour?" But Jesse was persistent and firmly said, "We'll give Mom 5 minutes, all right, 10 minutes to get ready, and we'll wait downstairs." When she came downstairs, there was an old but still quite decent car parked outside, with happy faces of her husband and son peeking out. Jesse, smiling with joy, opened the door for her and ceremoniously said, "Ladies and gentlemen, my queen, into the limousine. It may not look like one yet, but I'm going to take you and our son to the palace, even if it's not a real one." Sitting in the seat, Brittany smiled and, leaning toward her husband, whispered, "Did you steal this antique?" Antique. In response, Jesse just smiled, kissed her, and started the car. Within half an hour, they arrived at a beautiful 2-story cottage surrounded by construction. Turning to the back seat, they saw that Gregory was sweetly asleep, curled up in a ball. Jesse took off his jacket and, looking at his son, quietly said, "Well, it looks like we're going on a reconnaissance mission together." Seeing the construction, Brittany thought her husband wanted to show off his achievements and affectionately said, "You're doing so well, Jesse. You're building such magnificent homes for people. I hope that someday we'll move into one just like this." Jesse took her by the shoulders and, looking directly into her eyes, calmly said, "This is our future home. I wanted to surprise you. See, I managed to hold off and brought you here to see it as it's being built." Brittany couldn't believe that Jesse, who had been a drifter not so long ago, was talking about such things. "Is this really our house?" she asked with disbelief. Jesse responded in a completely calm and confident voice, "Yes, darling, just hold on for a couple more months, and you'll be deciding what curtains to hang in these windows." Holding back her emotions and pausing for a couple of minutes, Brittany hesitantly said, "I have some news for you as well. I'm pregnant. The doctors suspect it might be twins. We'll know for sure a little later." Now it was Jesse's turn to be amazed. He stood for a moment, stunned, and then embraced Brittany lightly and joyfully. When the time came, they welcomed 2 beautiful and healthy babies into the world.